Hello everybody, I'm Steve Carlson. So today I'm going to start to hit a little harder on the issue of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now they've done many things recently to make themselves the issue, and they sure are. And actually, the questions that face voters in 2016 are two. Will the U.S. Supreme Court survive so that it can play its role in maintaining the United States as a constitutional order? And two, with the crossing the line by not only Minnesota courts, but now the latest response from the U.S. Supreme Court, will representative democracy survive in the United States? And while certain law clerks at the U.S. Supreme Court might think that this is some kind of mood, hilarious, frivolous, or malicious issue from 2012 and 2014 Minnesota elections, in reality, for the 2016 Democratic National Convention, they are, in advance, forewarning everybody who thinks they might be a good Democratic voter that their delegations must be at least 50% women, must have certain proportional representation for all minority groups, ethnic groups, homosexual groups, and must be chosen with these quotas. So the issue that I raised in 2012 because of so-called voting rights, which were raised as an issue by my opponent in a congressional election, Betty McCollum, in a publicly broadcast debate which I participated in, is that in reality, the DNC, Democratic National Convention, with the loving approval of the U.S. Supreme Court, is prepared, once again, in this election to help Hillary Clinton. These quotas were proposed by her former campaign manager, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's now chairing the DNC. They're preparing to abridge and deny the constitutionally protected voting rights of white men, of white women, of men in general, and of straight, non-perverse, non-homosexual voters. All of these quotas, with the avid support of Barack Obama, are required for the meeting in Philadelphia in 2016. So these are the issues. Can the Supreme Court survive? Now, why would the Supreme Court not survive? Well, the issue came up before, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And when Obama said he was going to be like FDR, he might have been talking about the packing of the court. And there was a real question then whether FDR would allow the Democratic Party to change the structure of the U.S. Supreme Court by expanding it and forcing the older Supreme Court justices into retirement. Well, the Democrats have solved that problem. They've learned how to pack a court. And I have to say, the Republicans on this issue, as in almost every other issue, have been totally hapless and feckless. And they have not stood up for the United States Constitution. This is why you had the Tea Party and independent voters stand up for the Constitution. But they're being drowned out. They're being drowned out by the media. They're being drowned out by big money paying the media. And basically, we need a Paul Revere in 2016. We need to make America great again, because it currently is not great. It has a so-called leader who's really a winner of many quota systems that took away the right to vote from white males and gave it to not only white women, but to white women who would approve of this sort of thing. Lately, we have Barbra Streisand come out and say she endorses Hillary Clinton. Why? Well, we need a woman president. This is what Barbra Streisand, people who need people, and all that kind of jive. Well, she no longer needs people. She needs a woman president, right? And she's trying to impose this kind of Hollywood shtick on every American and fatally on the United States as a constitutional order. Now, would it be a problem if someone like Hillary Clinton, well, certainly Hillary Clinton, but a woman was elected president? Is that the problem? Yes, with Hillary Clinton. But in general, our Constitution, as amended, definitely allows this. It allows states to prescribe the manner in which the president and members of the U.S. Senate and U.S. House are to be elected to Congress. For Congress, that's in Article 1 and Section 4, that each state has the power and that duty, and once they do that, they are bound to abide by it, to follow it, to do it. And they are also forbidden the right to bar the right to vote based on people's sex. That's what the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, that's what it says. It doesn't say women can vote or that men can vote. It says no one can be denied, have their right to vote be denied or even abridged. That means stepped on, okay? Limited in some unnatural way other than it would naturally be. So the natural condition, it is said in our Constitution and clarified by 2 amendments, is that everybody that the states have not excluded for various reasons like felony or incompetence can vote. And it's clarified in also a 3rd amendment, which is the one lowering the voting age so that states couldn't exclude people who are 18 years or older. And then, of course, famously, the so-called suffrage amendment, which gave and protected the right to vote of men as much as it did of women. Now, Congress never prescribed this. And why was that? Why did Congress not just pass a law that said women could vote? Why didn't they do that? Well, first of all, someone else could have got elected into the next Congress. Let's say women didn't come out to vote fast enough after Congress passed the law, and the all-male voters in some states, which were all-male, because women were already voting in some states such as Wyoming and North Dakota right over here, I believe it's probably South Dakota, where you had the first female representatives named Rankin, Jeanette Rankin, I believe, back in 1917. But they could have put a new Congress in, and that might have reversed that law and taken away the right to vote for women. But the second and most important reason was that the Constitution, as I've said, Article 1, Section 4, had already committed that command and right to each of the states to prescribe the manner for the election of House members and senators. And actually, there was a time when the senators were not directly elected. They were elected by your legislature. Now, this just shows the power of legislatures. And today in Minnesota, the legislature is abusing that power to make sure that a contest, for instance, a recount, like Al Franken reversed on Norm Coleman to get into the office that I ran against him for in the recent election, would never stop a governor from going ahead and sending a sworn certificate to the House of Congress, whether that's the U.S. House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate, to put in there the person whom he wanted. So essentially, now what the legislature has done is create a situation where the governor appoints rather than follows the election law prescribed under the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 4. And so the reason the 19th Amendment was needed and not a law passed by Congress is that the very existence of the 19th Amendment came out of the U.S. Constitution. It did not come out of an act of Congress, did not come out of your state legislatures. And right now it's being abandoned by and ignored by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's being abandoned by the state of Minnesota and by the Democratic National Committee, who are now choosing the next nominee of the Democratic Party on the basis of gender. And Bernie Sanders hasn't said anything about that. I believe that eventually he will, but obviously that's tricky for him because he'll polarize the women's vote. They'll start talking about that article he wrote about the fantasies of women back when he was in college. And it just won't work for him. So they're just going ahead, they're forging ahead with this women's thing, which they're turning this country into. And the same for race. You can't abridge or deny anyone's vote based on race. So not only are men's votes equally protected by the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but whites' votes are equally protected by the 15th Amendment, okay? And so what's happening now is we have a movement toward quotas in delegate selection, who in turn choose the nominees on the general election ballot in your state, including Minnesota. Now, in some states, that's subjected to a primary, in which the endorsed candidate has a great advantage. And so the bias and discrimination in the endorsement is of great import. I just ran against the endorsed nominee of the Independence Party and defeated him. And Mark Dayton ran against the endorsed nominee of the Democratic Party, who was a woman and who was elected because of the gender quotas that Minnesota has in our election law, which I have been saying since I had a voice, are unconstitutional, and the people under our Constitution have that final voice, and that voice is being stifled and eliminated carefully by these industrious major parties of the Democratic Party of the United States, the Democratic Party. It's a corrupt political machine in the classic sense of Tammany Hall, the ones who are meeting in Philadelphia in 2016 and who are going to choose Hillary Clinton because at least 50% of the delegates selected in every state, 50 states and the District of Columbia, who go to that convention are required by that party, by law, to be women. Now after that, you have to add on quotas for minorities. Now minorities are also required in Minnesota, the quotas, and at the DNC for the whole nation, to be represented by a quota. Now I'm a white man, and I'm restricted to about 35 to 40% of the vote. We can't have more of the vote than that to choose the delegates. And this is what the DNC is now imposing on the entire nation in order to push Hillary Clinton in there. I've always cherished our Constitution. I really think, ideally, it's the best form of government on the entire planet. It was strong enough to actually replace monarchy. The French never replaced monarchy. They've had 5 or 6 different constitutions. They have a very centralized government. They don't have a First Amendment. They don't have free speech. Instead, they try to do this, like I was saying before, by passing laws. So the Parliament passes laws, and then every once in a while, the Constitution, since it's not important anyway, is just changed, and someone brings in a new Constitution. Well, for America, the Constitution is the cornerstone of our very way of life. Obviously, that cornerstone is very much under assault by people like the Democratic Party, and especially Barack Obama, who is a cynical, conniving lone wolf, fighting Congress and fighting the world, allying himself with theocracies in the Middle East to gain more land for the Muslim empire which he serves, which he will leave when he leaves office. And the Democrats, with all these quota systems, were foolish enough to not only put him in there in the first place, but to allow riots in the streets, killing police officers, in order to push him into a second term. And now Hillary Clinton is even running on his record. Oh, she's trying to draw distinctions with him on some points. But overall, she's a third term of Barack Obama. And these people are assaulting the very cornerstone of our society's existence. What audacity, what hubris, what arrogance, and what peril for this nation. We are back in those times, those very exciting times, which we experienced in the birth of a nation, our nation, which was in the beginning of the Republic. And I urge everybody to continually study this so that you may understand it. Because trust me, civics class or no civics class, you did not learn this in your school. This is something that is hidden from you, that's spoon-fed to you today by public school teachers and political labor unions who are trying to force a new history on the nation. I say we need to go back and learn the real history of the U.S. and try to understand it. We have so many ways to do that now. We have the internet, really cluttered with information, including some competing views, and we have people who can put it together for you. I will certainly try to use my resources to put that out there. What is the birth of our nation all about? And so it's at risk, because in Philadelphia in 2016, the Democrats have already pronounced, and the Supreme Court has had it in front of them, and turn up their noses at the Constitution. They turn up their noses at America and talk about how brilliant this current crop thinks that they are. They've overturned 2,000 years, not only of our marriage laws, which clearly existed within those 2,000 years, but they've overturned 2,000 years of marriage practices to say that a man and a woman joined together in matrimony is not marriage. They know better, okay? I don't want to start naming names right now. I will refer to Antonin Scalia, because he said something very important recently. But to the Supreme Court, they know better. Hey, who needs a president? Who needs Congress? Who needs states? Who needs the people? The Supreme Court can rule, and the rest of us can just carry out their commands. And they don't need any constitutional basis to rule. They just happen to be there for life. They can never be dislodged. They won't be impeached because politicians lack the courage and integrity to dislodge them. And so they will rule. And so as the composition of that court is changed by appointments by compliant Congresses who carefully rubber stamp the extremist political appointments of presidents now seeking to get reparations in the Supreme Court, get that payback. He hasn't appointed any black yet. I guess he wants to be on it. If Hillary Clinton gets elected, we'll have Chief Justice Barack Obama. Can you imagine it? The guy has no judgment, no discernment, no honesty, and has shown himself to aid our enemies at many turns, and has challenged the moral authority of the United States, obviously, challenged the fairness and honesty of those framers who carefully tried to construct a constitution based on establishing government that could withstand the assault of partisan politics. Obviously, that's no longer possible in the age of commercial television, who try to figure out how they can make the most money as a means of determining, calling elections, and hiding and stuffing and stifling the discussion of issues while they appoint people like Barack Obama. And now they're trying to appoint a queen, Hillary Clinton. And Barbra Streisand sings, "She must be a queen." But then Barbara is not a fat lady. She's not that fat. And so her announcement of a woman, of a queen, is not conclusive. You still have a chance to go out there and vote. You still have a chance to pay attention to the real underlying issues. To give you an example of what's an underlying issue and what isn't, just yesterday, the news media announced that the great issue of the day is whether the gestures of Donald Trump were offensive. He was talking about a reporter who had reported Muslims in New Jersey jumping up and down, celebrating as our World Trade Center was destroyed. People were falling, bodies thudding to the ground. And these people were celebrating according to this reporter's original reporting. And now he says he doesn't remember. He can't remember what he wrote. He can't remember why he wrote it. And what he wrote is obvious. But he doesn't know who he talked to or why. He might well be terrified. Because other people were celebrating about 9/11 as well. One of them was Obama's mentor, who he said made him a Christian, Jeremiah Wright. And you know what? Surprisingly, he can't remember either. He can't remember ever hearing Jeremiah Wright say the chickens have come home to roost on 9/11. I don't think he ever remembered being there. He also never remembered Jeremiah's videotaped, widely publicized preaching that said, "God damn America." Now, here we're at this point in time where there's a big issue. Can we stop those who cheer and welcome 9/11? Those who are pulling us out of our position of trying to secure peace in the Middle East, creating their own little armies, including Hillary Clinton, created these armies in ISIS, and now are empowering a newly elected theocratic state, Turkey, to fight with us in a new kind of crusade against Putin. Putin is a Christian, always has been a Christian, was baptized Christian, but at that time lived in Stalin's society. And he disagrees with the U.S. Supreme Court that homosexuals coupling are married families. Putin disagrees with that. He disagrees with all of what he calls homosexual propaganda. Well, who's leading the homosexual propaganda in the whole planet? Barack Obama. He's an embarrassment. He embarrasses us in Africa. He embarrasses us every place he goes. And so now Obama joined our military after he's been washed out in the congressional elections, but now the Congress are a bunch of compliant wimps. That's at best. We also have anti-American Democrats who are cheering this on. All of these developments because they believe it benefits their party. Their party is nothing but the footstool for a dictator. And how will we deal with a dictator? And the issue of in the coming election, in that important election in Philadelphia next year, is our Constitution, with all of its foibles, including that the Supreme Court can be stacked with anti-American, anti-Christian individuals who will join with the dictator to promote his destruction of this country, can that Constitution operate and withstand the developments and events that we are witnessing, the history that we are witnessing today? You're a part of that history. There'll still be history. It will be pretty much the same history in 50 years from now. History will be history. And you need careful historical methods to try to determine the truth from the record that will be the stuff of history. The question is, will America be history? But you'll be in there. Maybe you will be on the side of those who stood for the Constitution where you needed to stand, did not just pay lip service, defended our liberty and our constitutional rights and requirements. You have rights, yes. There are requirements in the U.S. Constitution that have to be followed, or your rights will be lost, to be sure. And your rights are not the only issue in that Constitution, which is to establish a government to secure those rights, but also protect the government against these kinds of constitutional crises. So the 2016 election is a constitutional crisis. This is why you see the tepid Republican so-called leaders fighting against Donald Trump, fighting against the American people, any voice, any leader that speaks out in favor of our constitutional rights, and against the imminent fiscal collapse of our economy, as all our jobs are outsourced. We are now subservient to other nations, like China, who is really another one of Barack's best friends. Some people in the last election, 70% of the Asians who voted to make Barack Obama president. Can you imagine? Well, we have to back off. We need to get away from these gender and race quotas, because the Asians had to play along. Everybody has to play along with the quota game that runs through the Democratic Party to the White House and to Congress. So I've got a suit in the U.S. Supreme Court that addresses this. I've now heard initially from the Supreme Court. That's not their final answer, but their final answer must be to protect the U.S. Constitution, to require Governor Dayton and not handpick, make him follow the law which allows the contest to bring these issues to the U.S. Senate and not play senator as a judge who has no jurisdiction over this. And he's not allowed to handpick his senator from Minnesota, who he handpicked as Senator Al Franken, but not in conformity with Minnesota election laws. He supplanted his idea of what the requirements for the election of Congress in Minnesota should be for the actual law passed by the legislature. So I was raising all of these issues about taking the vote away from white men, white women, men, straight people, religious people, lost their vote under the quota system of the Democratic nomination process that goes straight to the ballot, straight to, in the case of Barack Obama, to the White House. And who knows, probably Hillary Clinton would have done the same if he had not stepped in front of her entitlement, because these are all entitlements. Now these laws in Minnesota and in every state are prescribed by the legislature. That means they're written before the election, and therefore they need to be enforced and followed during a subsequent election. And Dayton has gone further, and that Minnesota state legislature, a legislative body with inherent rights which cannot be taken away, to be the sole judge of the qualifications and membership of the Minnesota House and Minnesota Senate, not Mark Dayton, not any Minnesota court, because that resides entirely in that body. But each of those houses, respectively, in the Minnesota legislature joined with Mark Dayton to strip away from the U.S. Congress, from Minnesota, those same ancient inherent rights, which is to be the sole judges of their qualifications and membership, because Mark Dayton lost that. He gave it away for the people of Minnesota, who placed that power in the hands of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. And the clerk, somewhere, an IFP clerk, feels that this is hilarious, it's funny, it's impossible. But clearly stated in a Minnesota Supreme Court filing by the Minnesota Secretary of State then, Mark Ritchie, he's gone now, hopefully back to Georgia somewhere, wherever he comes from. That same filing said precisely what I'm saying, that Mark Dayton, within hours of the beginning of a contest on these matters I'm raising, secretly signed and had Mark Ritchie seal the so-called election of comedian Al Franken, the latest Democrat celebrity, to make you laugh, to make you forget that you forfeited your right to vote as a white man, as a white woman, and as a man, or of whatever race, and also as a man who is not a pervert, who believes in sacred, ancient rights of marriage, which are under assault today by this rigged system with the rule of Supreme Court hotshot lawyers. But these issues, plus the manipulation of public information to keep those email addresses out of the hands of independent voters who could take money out of politics today, and also the lawlessness of the courts preventing these issues from being brought to the Senate and the House, remain on the table. They've been blocked from being addressed. And I'm asking the U.S. Supreme Court to unblock that, simply to follow the Constitution, let these issues be brought to the U.S. Senate. That's what I'm asking. That's what's required by the U.S. Constitution. And the facts of this case show that Mark Dayton short-circuited that. He violated the Constitution. And if the U.S. Supreme Court allows this to happen in Minnesota, they will allow it to happen throughout the country. And there will be no place where you can contest the corrupt actions of local partisans, in this case the DFL in Minnesota, and we won't have a representative democracy or Republican form of government. And the United States is required by the Constitution to make sure that we have that in every state. Now today, the Washington Post announced that the 2016 ballot wars have begun, so the candidates can get on the ballots in the various states. The U.S. Supreme Court believes these ballot wars, however, are frivolous and malicious, unless you have the money to play in their so-called brilliant, brave new Supreme Court with their gender-based pronouncements and coronations of Queen Hilly. The Boston Globe reports independent voters are the key to New Hampshire, the primary for president. But independent voters' rights and their rights have been trampled around the nation, most especially in Minnesota. And so the Supreme Court and Minnesota courts are determining, obviously, the election for president. And for all federal offices, as they yield the constitutional requirements to the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, to administer in their stead. In Minnesota, like New Hampshire, you don't have to register to vote in the party primaries. You don't have to register with the party. You don't have to register in their party. Of course, you need to be a registered voter. Isn't that something? You have the right to vote. But in order to do that, in most states, you need to register as a Democrat or as a Republican. An incredible level of corruption in lifting up of these two major parties. No wonder they have so much arrogance that they come into a state and they shut down the free and fair election process. And now quotas for gender, quotas by race, quotas for homosexuals, and an out-of-control U.S. Supreme Court. Now, in New Hampshire, they call these undeclared voters. That's just you and me, Joe Voter, okay? By the press and the parties who suffocate democracy in America. Americans, however, have already declared independence. We have declared the Constitution, and now we need to regulate the practices of the states who are, in the words of the Democratic resident celebrity from Minnesota, rigged. I ask you to follow up on this, to share the details of this scandal, and to take back our free and fair elections in 2016. I ask for your vote. I'm running for president. I ask that you abandon the feckless Republicans, abandon the anti-American, unconstitutional Democrats. Organize, run, and vote for American liberty and to make America great again. I'm Steve Carlson, and I approve this message.